Hi everyone, and welcome to today's lecture that's going to introduce you to the Uppsala Conflict Data Program. My name is Emil Petersson, and I will introduce you to the UCDP encyclopedia and some of the definitions that we use. And when I'm done with this presentation, my colleague Marcelina Priadi will show you how to use the actual encyclopedia on our website online. The UCDP is a project within the Department of Peace and Conflict Research that gathers non-partisan systematic data on conflict intensity and the number of conflicts in the world. The purpose of gathering this data is so that it can be used in academia and by the general public when interested, such as for teaching purposes and by journalists and as such. We gather our data so that it's comparable over time and that it's possible to see conflict trends over time as well as compare them over space. And in order to do this, we use quite strict definitions, which is what I'm going to show to you today, because some of them may not be intuitive to a person who's never done peace and conflict research before. So basically, the definition that we use of armed state-based conflict, which is the conflict type that you're going to be looking at in your course paper, actually has a formal definition that we use every single time, and it sounds like this. An armed state-based conflict is a contested incompatibility that concerns government and/or territory where the use of armed force between two parties, of which at least one is the government of a state, results in at least 25 battle-related deaths per year. And this may seem a little bit like researchy and hard to understand, so I'm actually going to break it down and explain what all the parts of this definition mean. So, what a state-based conflict is that it's organized violence, and the UCDP gathers information about three different categories of organized violence. The first one being the state-based conflicts, the second is non-state conflicts, and this third one is one-sided violence. But today we will focus on the state-based conflicts, which are the ones that you will be looking at for your course paper. And what it means that a conflict is state-based is that at least one of the parties to a conflict is the government of a state. But of course, both of them could be a government, and that's what we called international armed conflicts, which in common tongue is usually referred to as wars. But for your course paper, you will be looking at conflicts within states, and that means that one of the parties is the government of a state. And these conflicts are what we call intrastate armed conflicts, so within the state. Every conflict also consists of what we call dyads, or pairs of actors. There needs to be two actors for there to be a conflict. Examples of this could be that the government is fighting a rebel group A, but it could also be that it's fighting both a rebel group A and a rebel group B. So a conflict can consist of an indefinite amount of dyads, or pairs. Something that is very important for our definition is that all these pairs needs to have an incompatibility, or in more simple terms, a disagreement. The parties need to disagree formally about something for there to be an armed conflict according to our definition. And there are actually two kinds of incompatibilities or disagreements. The first one being over territory and the second one being over government. In some instances, conflicts can actually have incompatibilities over both territory and government, but as a general rule, parties tend to disagree about one of these two things. And what does it mean that it has to be 25 battle-related deaths? And this is where the UCDP kind of differs from the reality the most. I mean, two parties having a disagreement is quite intuitive, but a battle-related death is someone who dies as a direct result of fighting between the parties. So, for example, the UCDP only concerns itself with people being killed by gunfire or by artillery, or people being beaten to death by sticks. We do not include, for example, people who die from disease or famine caused by the conflict. We do not count people who die from neglect because basic societal functions break down. We only count the people who die as a result of the fighting. And this is going to be very important later. So if we move on to see what these different kinds of incompatibilities can look like. So starting with the intrastate conflicts over government. And this means that there is a government fighting against one or more rebel groups over an incompatibility that concerns, for example, the political system or the replacement or changing of composition of the current government. So basically what they do is that they disagree about how the entire country is being run. A practical example of this could, for example, be military coups, where someone tries to depose the ruling government. And in the encyclopedia, you can actually see right away, as Marcelina will show you later, whether or not a conflict is over government. Because when you click on a country and you see that there is a conflict called the name of the country and then government, then you know right away that this is a conflict over government, as can be seen in this example where we have Sudan government. Then you know that there's going to be parties disagreeing on the entire political system or the entire or parts of government of Sudan. Something that is a little bit special that can be quite hard to grasp is that the UCDP consider that there can only be one conflict over government in a country. But there can, however, be an indefinite amount of dyads within this conflict. And these dyads don't even need to have the same incompatibility. For example, we can have a conflict over government in a country and one rebel group might be fighting for democracy and another one might be fighting for the establishment of a communist regime. But nevertheless, as the UCDP sees the world, it's still only going to be one conflict over government. And why is this? It relates in part to the fact that according to our definition at the UCDP, there can only be one government in a country at any given time. And this may not always reflect reality, because you can think of cases where there are two groups claiming to be the government of a state. So then we make a decision, and usually that decision is made based on who is currently controlling the capital. There are, of course, some exceptions from this rule, but in general, the party or the group that controls the capital of a state is usually considered a government by the UCDP. This also means that a rebel group can transition from being a rebel group into being the government or the other way around. For example, as the example in Cambodia in 1979, where the Khmer Rouge, or the Red Khmer, which most of you are probably at least a little bit familiar with, when they were driven away from the capital Phnom Penh by another group called the KUFNS, which meant that the Khmer Rouge stopped being the government of Cambodia and became a rebel group, and the KNU-FNS stopped being a rebel group and became the government. So, if we move on to the second type of incompatibility, and those are the intrastate conflicts over territory. And again, it's when a government of a state fights against one or more rebel groups over a piece of land. So, in this type of incompatibility, the parties usually don't disagree about the entire country, how it's being run, but more a part of it. And typical incompatibilities are, for example, secession, that a piece of territory wants to leave the country altogether, or autonomy, that a part of a country wants more self-rule. These are two typical territorial incompatibilities, but there can, of course, be variations to these types as well. And in the encyclopedia, you can see if a conflict has a territorial incompatibility the same way that you can see that it's a government. We will have the name of the country in which the conflict is, and then you will actually see the name of the contested territory, as the example I have here with the separatist conflict in Aceh in Indonesia. So then you can see that Indonesia has a separatist conflict, or a territorial incompatibility, with a territory called Aceh. It's also important to note that the same piece of territory can actually be contested by several different groups. We have an example in India where the state of Manipur is claimed by both rebel groups in the actual state of Manipur, but also in the neighboring state of Nagaland. So there is no limit to how many groups can claim a piece of territory. And unlike the conflicts over government, there can be an indefinite amount of territorial conflicts in a country, and there can also be an indefinite amount of dyads within each conflict, which means that there can be one or two or three, or how many you can think of, groups fighting for the secession or autonomy of the same piece of territory. And now we're actually going to take a little look at what we do at the UCDP, where we produce conflict data and conflict trends. And this graph will show you why it's so important to study intrastate armed conflicts, because as you can see, all the conflicts that are any shade of red in this graph is actually intrastate armed conflicts. The pinkish ones are the international armed conflicts, or the ones where two countries fight each other. And as you can see, that since 1946 there has been a rather dramatic increase in the number of intrastate conflicts, the dark red and the light red, and a relative decline in wars between countries. So this actually shows that the study specifically of intrastate armed conflict is very important. And if you're curious about the meaning of the different shades of red, the darker one is the conflicts that we have been talking about, where a government fights against one or more rebel groups. And the light red one is something that we call internationalized intrastate armed conflicts, which I will tell you a little bit more about later. But I can tell you right now, that's when there is a rebel group and a government fighting within a country, and the government of another state supports one of the parties in this intrastate conflict. So where one of the groups receives outside support from another country and another government, basically. And just in case that you're not convinced that we need to look at state-based conflicts based on their numbers, we can also see from the number of people killed in armed conflicts or in organized violence, as we put it, since 1989, that the red line, which is people killed in state-based conflicts, which then also include the wars between countries as well as wars within countries, that the red line closely approximates the white line, which is the total number of people killed. And what this tells us is that the majority of people who die in organized violence in the world actually die in state-based conflicts, which is why it's so important for us to study them and to understand them, because that's the first step to resolving them and preventing them. And as you can see in this graph, there is some spikes, or where the number of deaths increase quite dramatically. And in case you're curious, I'm just going to show you which conflicts that create these spikes. So for example, in 1994, the spike that goes off the charts, that's the Rwandan genocide. And what's interesting about this, other than the fact that it's so much more deadly than any of the other conflict years that we have in this graph, is that it shows the particular nature of a genocide. I mean, it doesn't really compare to anything else. It's off the charts when it comes to the number of people killed. The second spike we have in approximately 99 and 2000, that's largely explained by the conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea. And the most recent spike that you can see, which started somewhere around 2011, 2012, that's mostly the people killed in the wars in Syria and also Iraq. And if you're curious what the graph would look like if Syria and Iraq would not have had intrastate wars, I can tell you that it would have been roughly the same as the years before. So the big increase that we've had since the early 2010s is almost completely explained by the conflict in Syria and also the conflict in Iraq. But however, not all conflicts in the world only have two primary parties fighting against each other. That is, the two groups that actually disagree, but sometimes other people get involved, and other states particularly can get involved. At the UCDP, we call external involvement directly in a conflict secondary party support. So a party who supports a primary party in a conflict is a secondary party. And secondary party support can be of two different kinds. The first one is non-warring, and the second one is warring support. The non-warring support is when a state, a government, organization or group, like a diaspora, for example, which means that ethnic kin who live in another country, send support to one of the primary parties in the conflict, usually in the form of weapons or in the form of money to fund a war. What's important to note here that the UCDP considers that an individual person cannot be a secondary non-warring party. So one person sending lots of money to a rebel group cannot be considered a secondary non-warring party, because party implies group, and the UCDP concerns itself only with groups. And the secondary non-warring support must be directly related to the fighting itself. So as I said, it could be money or weapons. It could be allowing a rebel group to use bases on your territory if you're another state. But it cannot be, for example, more general financial aid. So Sweden cannot be considered a secondary non-warring party if we provide development aid to a country where there is a civil war. And then the second kind of secondary support is the warring kind. And according to the UCDP, a secondary warring party can only be the government of another state. This has to do with our data collection, because it's simply not possible for us to gather systematic data on everyone who supports someone in a civil war directly with troops. And these are the kinds of conflicts that are called the internationalized intrastate armed conflicts. So when we have another government from another country where the conflict is not happening, supporting one party with troops, for example, airstrikes, artillery strikes, even sending in special forces or real army units, that's when we have the internationalized intrastate armed conflicts or internationalized civil wars. A practical example of this could be when the international coalition intervened to help the government of Afghanistan to fight the Taliban. And a more recent example is the Russian involvement in Syria, where it's actively helping the government of Syria fighting the various rebel groups. And in the encyclopedia, you can actually find information about this kind of secondary warring support, which Marcelina will show you later. But I can tell you right now that if you go to any actor page and press the button called Read More, you can find information if this party has received secondary warring support from another government. Of course, a rebel group could provide secondary warring support, and that's even quite common, but it's not something that we gather information about at the UCDP, so that's information that you will have to find yourselves elsewhere. But I just want to point out that just because we don't gather information about it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. So rebel groups definitely provide secondary warring support as well. And now we're actually going to move over to one of our other categories of organized violence that I mentioned in the beginning, which is the one-sided violence. And I would like to point out that this is actually a category of its own that we gather information about on a monthly basis, as well as the state-based conflicts. But sometimes this can actually be part of a state-based conflict where one-sided violence is used as a strategy. And one-sided violence simply means that a government or a rebel group or other kind of organized group is they intentionally kill unarmed civilians. And even if it sounds horrible, it's quite common for this to be used as a strategy in an armed conflict to, for example, break the morale of your opponent. Examples of one-sided violence includes ethnic cleansing, genocides, or the killing of unarmed protesters, for example. And as you saw in the graph before, the Rwandan genocide, that's like the most terrifying example of one-sided violence that we've had since 1989. And why it's important for you to know about this one-sided violence, even though you're using it, or even though you're writing about state-based conflicts, is that it could be a part of your conflict dynamic. So if you're writing about a rebel group and go to that group's page in the encyclopedia and see that they actually have conducted one-sided violence, it's a good idea to read the description on that one-sided violence page, because it could be related to the conflict that you're writing about. And it's also important to emphasize that one-sided violence do not include collateral damage in our conflict. So it's not one-sided violence when civilians are killed by misplaced airstrikes or when they're caught in the crossfire. So even though lots of civilians are killed in war, not all of it ends up in our one-sided violence category. So it's the intentional killing of civilians when, for example, a government sends troops to specifically murder civilians. So not when they're killed because the government misplaces a bomb when trying to bomb rebels, for example. The final category of organized violence that we gather data on at the UCDP is the non-state conflicts. And a non-state conflict is when two groups, none of which is the government of a state, fight each other. The connection between non-state conflicts and state-based conflicts is not as clear as the one between one-sided violence and state-based conflict, but it could still be an important part of the conflict dynamic. An example could be that it's quite common that rebel groups split. So, for example, a hardline faction within a rebel group may be discontent with the group negotiating with the government, breaking away. Sometimes these breakaway factions just start fighting the government on their own, but sometimes they even attack their parent faction, as we call it, or the original group that they splintered from. And this can be an important part of a civil war dynamic. It could also be that two rebel groups fight each other because they're claiming the same territory. So in a country, if we have two rebel groups with different incompatibilities with the government, so one wants to create an autonomous state and one wants to create an entirely independent state in a country, they can fight each other because they disagree on that territory between themselves. So groups can actually fight each other even though it's not directly related to their respective conflicts with the government. And it's also important to note that these non-state conflicts that we have in our encyclopedia can be completely unrelated to state-based violence as well. They can include like clashes between ethnic or religious communities, or conflicts between farmers and herders. So all non-state conflicts that we have in the encyclopedia are not strictly related to a state-based conflict, which is good for you to know. And we also have some questions that tend to pop up when we present this encyclopedia, and as you are only watching a clip, we figured that we're gonna present some of those questions to you right away. And the first one is like, why is the UCDP's death figure so low? Because I found this other source that claimed that twice as many people died in this one conflict I'm interested in. And this has to do with the fact that we at the UCDP are very, very careful when we gather our conflict data. We only use well-established sources that are predetermined before we start gathering the data, and it can include news reports from well-established news agencies, NGO reports like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International. And we always make what we call conservative estimates, that we only include the deaths that we are absolutely certain happened. So we don't go by rumor. We need to verify the numbers that we use. And as I've already mentioned, we exclude all deaths that are indirectly related to the conflict. So, as I said, people who die from famine or disease caused by the conflict. That's not numbers that you're going to find in the UCDP. We only include deaths that occur from the direct and purposeful killing of other humans. So this is why our figures can sometimes be much lower than other estimates, but generally our estimates are highly what we call reliable, that you can trust that they are actually accurate. So if we say that 1,000 people died in a conflict, you can be very certain that we know that 1,000 people died, but it could also have been more. Another question that tends to pop up is why we use weird names for our rebel groups. Because some of you may be familiar with the group called Boko Haram, which is active in Nigeria and its neighboring countries. But in our data set, you wouldn't find the group under the name Boko Haram. You would find it under its original name, which is the Yamatul Alis Sunna Lida Awati Wal Jihad, which is a bit tricky on the tongue. But the reason that we have names that may not correspond with the popular names that you would read in the newspapers or hear on the evening news is that if they are available, we will always call a group what they call themselves in their mother tongue. We also prioritize the use of acronyms. So if a group has a short version of its name, like the example I have here with PIRA, which stands for the Provisional Irish Republican Army, we will use that one. So it could be a good idea when you're looking for a group in the encyclopedia to try alternative names, and this is something that Marcelina is going to show you later on. One of the bigger questions that might occur to you is the one about terrorism, because that's something that is very current right now. We have a lot of media attention directed towards terrorism, especially international terrorism, and then you can ask yourself, is this something that I can find in the UCDP? Because some of the groups that you can write about for your course paper will in other sources be labeled as a terrorist organization or a terrorist group. And you should know that UCDP does not track terrorism as a separate category of organized violence. And then you may ask us, but are deadly terrorist attacks still included in the conflict data? And the answer to that is yes, as long as the attack is perpetrated by a group and as long as we know who's responsible for the terrorist attack. And what this means is that some terrorist attacks are perpetrated by individuals, not on the behalf of an organized group. An example that might be well known to most of you who are from Scandinavia is the attacks in Norway conducted by Anders Behring Breivik, which is an attack that you will not find in the UCDP because Breivik was not part of an organized group. He acted as an individual. And similarly, we cannot include terrorist attacks where no one claims responsibility or where we think that the information about who was responsible for the attack is too dubious for us to trust, which means that a lot of attacks that gets claimed by a group but that we cannot verify will also be excluded. But the general rule is that we include terrorist violence as long as it's possible to verify who did it and as long as it was done by a group. And then it's also good to know that a terrorist attack can be coded by us in the conflict data as either state-based violence or as one-sided violence, depending on who is targeted. For example, if someone blows up a car bomb killing 4 police officers, that will be considered state-based violence because police are representatives of a state. But if someone guns down people at a concert with no police or military anywhere near it, then we're going to consider it one-sided violence. And it's also good for you to know that when the UCDP is uncertain what type of violence an attack was, if it was state-based or one-sided, we will always take the more careful option and code it as state-based violence rather than one-sided violence. And then all the information about our armed conflicts can be found in our conflict encyclopedia, which you can find at this web address. And now Marcelina is going to show you how to navigate this website and how to access the information that we have that I've been telling you about. So I'm going to hand over to Marcelina now, and thank you for listening.